Today I'm speaking with Victorian artist Chelle Destefano, and she's been named the winner of the inaugural Lake Art Prize with her work titled Navigating to Safe Space. So welcome, Chelle. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me today. And also thank you to Sarah for being our Auslan interpreter today. Chelle, your artwork has two main physical parts. There's a textile sheet, and this acts as a screen for a silent video projection. Could you describe the work as a whole for those people who haven't seen the artwork?
Yes, of course. So I performed the video and then decided to project it onto that piece of work, onto that beautiful piece of fabric, which is actually almost see-through in its own right. So on that piece of textile fabric, I also sewed some of the words that are part of the performance in Auslan and put them onto the screen in English. And I'm really, really happy with the result. Having that piece of fabric hanging there the way that it does in the gallery looks absolutely gorgeous. And yeah, the way it sort of shimmers and falls is exactly how I intended it to look, and that is of water. And that idea of that sort of movement of water. And I thought it was a beautiful thread. Yeah, absolutely gorgeous, the way it flows and falls.
So the significance then of the fabric or the textiles component is the motion and the physical qualities of water.
Indeed, yes, that flow, that constant flow, that ebb and movement of the water itself and the journey, and that search, as you may know from the actual piece of art, that search for community, that search for that safe space as a deaf person navigating the world, and that ebb and flow of movement of that seeking and searching, and then that ultimate finding of that safe place, which translates to that sense of self-identity, awareness of language and community. Thinking back of my experiences of my life while I was feeling rather oppressed, particularly in primary school and all of my schooling years, not having access to Auslan, having to learn to speak and lip read, which is a very common story, it actually left me feeling rather lost as a person without a true sense of culture and language. It wasn't till later in life, in my teenage years, that I started to learn Auslan and started to discover a little bit more about what I'd been missing, some of the gaps in language that had existed for me for all those years, and that desire to sort of feel a part of a community. And for me, that was the signing deaf community. That's a common journey, and it's something that, we as individuals come to accept. So I'd moved to Adelaide at one stage when I was about 21. I moved to Adelaide. So that was around about the year 2000. And in the years that I was in Adelaide, I started to meet more and more deaf people, more and more of the deaf community. And I made a very good friend, another deaf person in that area who, I think it was probably about 3 or 4 years, challenged me to sort of, grow and develop. And, we talked about some of our individual struggles and came together. And it's actually been, Roberta is her name. She certainly gave me some of the confidence that I needed as a deaf person to actually feel safe and to find a community where I can actually feel safe. And so that's expressed in my artwork. And it was essentially a 4-year journey of that constant looking to find that me, and where I fit in the world and where I could actually communicate who I was to myself and to others. And for me, water was very much a strong theme. Because it was about sort of moving and flowing to find this connection into something larger. And so the Lake Macquarie region, where you are obviously, has a very diverse network of different community members, which I thought was also in line with some of my personal story and some of my work. So the whole experience has been quite phenomenal. It's been quite an amazing journey.
That's wonderful. Chelle, you've actually just pretty much answered all of my questions in one go.
Oh, have I really?
That's okay. I'm sure I can think of more, but it's funny. I was going to ask you to comment I was going to ask you to comment on your experience in the arts as a deaf person and whether or not you thought there are still barriers in the art world for the deaf community. If so, what those barriers are?
There are some barriers that certainly still exist. Accessibility generally, it's about, raising awareness in the wider community about the need for captions, about the need for Auslan interpreters, to make sure that deaf people are able to access the world as equals. And the Arts Council, I found, can be very difficult to access, but they've certainly made some changes and it's become much better over the years. But yeah, the arts community in Victoria has paved the way, I think, in some regards to improve inclusivity for deaf people to the world of the arts. And we're certainly seeing things get better and better as years go by. Actually, interesting story. 2006 it was when I finished my Bachelor of Visual Arts. And that was in Adelaide at the time. After 5 years of study, started in 2001 and finally completed in 2006. And when I reflect on those years, it was so very difficult to truly, really access all of my learnings. It was incredibly frustrating at times. In the first year, I was, right in there, ready to get in there gung-ho. And I started the Bachelor of Arts, and I actually had a really difficult time of it, and it gave me the shock of my life. And I'd lived in Melbourne for the years leading up to that, and I hadn't done university study at that time, but I'd studied at other courses, and I'd always had interpreters made available to me. But by the time I arrived in Adelaide and enrolled in this course, what I found is that funding was very limited, which meant that I couldn't actually access the supports that I needed, and oftentimes that meant Auslan interpreters. So I would often go hours, I would have 2 to 4 hours a week with an interpreter. But, the study and the course and the lectures was a lot more hours in a week than that. So it was a lot of gesturing. It was a lot of getting information from other students who were incredibly helpful. I made some really good friends at university who were very helpful to me in the course. But it was later, probably a good 10 years later, maybe even 12 years later, when I really started to reflect and realise that some of the gaps that existed for me in my education were, not just in high school, but in my later years of study, related to my inability to access. And so it limited my ability to improve my work. And I didn't really know, at that time, I didn't have a strong identity. I knew that I was an artist, but for the very first time, my deafness became a barrier. Rather, it was a barrier put in place by others simply because I was deaf. So it took quite a bit of work in advocating, and I have won some awards in years gone by, I'm proud to say. But yeah, it's been really, really interesting just to sort of, realise the heart that's required, not just the head, not just the learning, but the heart that's required. So yeah, it took, another good 3 years after that for me to really make that shift. I was involved in, Auslan performances. I did some self-exploration, started to sort of, realise myself, what needed to happen, where I could sort of channel my talents. It's probably about last year that I really started to discover my talent in textiles and sewing, and it's something that I'm particularly enjoying at the moment. And yeah, we see it in the piece of art that's hanging in your walls at the moment. But it's definitely something that I sort of feel is very much it's the heart. So you can, be very critical and analytical in your head, and it's incredibly important. And it's, very important in order to actually pass the courses. But without full access to the courses, it's very, very difficult to take on that critical learning. And goodness, 42 almost now, there it is, my age. But it's taken all of these years to not just put in to competitions, but to actually be acknowledged and to receive the award that I've received from you guys. But it's been a journey for myself too, to realise the things I've missed out on, really, because of the barriers that exist. And I thank Lake Macquarie for actually, seeing me as an equal. the barrier didn't exist for me in this competition, and sort of trying to break through some of those barriers has been incredibly difficult over the years. But yeah, sometimes you've just got to be in the right place at the right time with everything that you've learned up until that point to really break through.
Now, can I just get back to the artwork for one more minute? You wrote a poem as part of the artwork. I was wondering, do you often use poetry or text in your art practice?
Only very recently has that become, look, as recently as the last 2 years-ish, maybe 1.5 years, that I've started to use that more and more in my practice. I do like writing. I've always enjoyed writing. I find it a really important way to sort of express yourself, to become more aware of yourself, the frustrations you're experiencing. Growing up as a deaf person, taking note of the things that I'm realising about myself, sometimes just how very unaware I was of myself and my own needs. I find it a really important reflective tool, way for me to sort of, connect with my creativity again. Because I do love to obviously work with my hands, in this instance sewing, but I also enjoy performing and sculpting, and obviously using Auslan in the video. So I was trying to sort of consider ways that I could bring a number of those things together. And while I was chatting with other deaf friends about some of these ideas, I was told that that was actually a really powerful idea. I also spoke with other friends who are hearing but sign, and other friends who are hearing but don't sign. And all of them said that it had a profound impact on them, the idea of how the work would be displayed, to a deaf audience, and also to a wider audience, to allow the deaf community and the wider community to come together as allies, to have a better understanding of each other's identity.
Well, I think your friends were right. It is a very powerful piece and beautifully presented. So we have all these components. We have your projection of yourself. You're reciting your poem using Auslan. So that in itself is a performance. So there's performance art. There's the beautiful screen, the textiles that falls in front of the projection with text sewn or embroidered into it. So your poem has been hand stitched and the fabric just falls beautifully and softly in front of the projection. So we've got text, there's poetry, there's performance, there's textiles, there's video. It's just such a layered and powerful piece. Really beautiful. And
it is layered, yeah, indeed.
Yeah,
and I'm just sort of thinking along those lines, sorry to interrupt, but that realization of, people sort of thinking that it is not just a projection on screen, but a projection of self, a way of raising awareness and sort of that exploration of self. It's been an utter joy, truly it has, and some of the other things, I'm thinking about what you've said just now, chatting with some mentors of mine who's had some experience in theatre, and this person has been mentoring me, and finding ways to sort of resolve issues that exist, working out how we can use English and Auslan, being such very different languages, but using them together in this one piece of work as a performance in Auslan, which is, a language in its own right. It's not signed English, it's Auslan, which there is a huge difference. So without any of the finger spelling that the English language contains, it was purely in Auslan, the performance, as we refer to it. So allowing the two languages to exist onto this same piece of work with this idea of the ebb and flow adds, I think, another layer to the power of it and how it can actually translate to a story of Auslan and its community of users.
And just getting back to the title, Navigating to Safe Space. Can you just recap on what does safe space mean to you, Chelle?
Language, identity, and just sort of that movement between who we are, what we've learned. See, in years gone by, I've learned the current term is audism, AUDISM. And audism is a term that's been coined to describe the journey that deaf communities experience around the world. Audism is a huge thing, and I could spend hours talking to you about it. But certainly for many deaf people in the hearing world, to truly access things, it means that they require support. So it might be interpreters to actually ensure that communication exists. And while we've got interpreters present, we're generally raising awareness about the needs of different language users. Having access to interpreters to so many more things means that we're better able to search for these safe spaces and find where they are for us.